Heat and drought conditions in Southeast Australia are often the product of natural weather patterns.
We saw two strong climate drivers affecting Australia. One of them was a positive Indian Ocean dipole, which is basically a pattern of sea surface temperatures in the Indian Ocean that causes above average temperature and below average rain in Australia.
This positive dipole was the strongest in 20 years.
We also had a negative southern annular mode at the end of the year. Basically that caused windier than usual conditions and drier than usual conditions in New South Wales.
But then also we've actually warmed by 1 degree Celsius. So it was all those things coming together in, I guess, the perfect storm of events that really made this summer so extreme.
But these temperatures and winds and drought were amplified by a third distressing factor.
Hello, we have serious climate change going on here.
Scientists have been ringing the alarm on climate change for decades. One of the loudest modern day voices is Dr. Michael Mann, an American climatologist, professor, and author. Mann just happened to be in Sydney on sabbatical during the record-breaking wildfire season.
It's pretty easy to connect the dots on this one. Again, we would not have been seeing such widespread, intense, and fast-spreading fires if it were not for the dryness and the heat due to human-caused climate change.
Why should someone watching this in the United States, in South Florida, care about what's happening thousands of miles away in Australia?
Well, what's happening here in Australia is really a warning to all of us. Pretty soon, we are going to see the same sorts of unprecedented events.
Climate change is clearly one of the key things that drives fire and fire behaviour. How do we know these things? Because we can read English. It's been documented time after time after time, and now the science has developed to the stage where we can actually start to pin individual fire events to actual changes in climate.
Here, the triggers of fire's fury descend from the sky.
The fires we've had are overwhelmingly lightning strike fires that have caused a lot of destruction this year.
And when we have dry lightning strikes, then we have more ignition points and we have more issues to do with fire.
They weren't able to stop the ignitions. They were just, lightning strike would start something up and they just couldn't stop it.
Often it's a vicious and merciless cycle. As lightning sparks fire, fires can in turn create lightning.
Fires get so big, they start creating their own lightning and their own wind.
The huge plumes of smoke cool as they rise into the atmosphere. Then they form clouds that can cause thunderstorms. New fires spark, winds whip, often overwhelming anything in its path. Firefighters sometimes lucky to escape. As fires give rise to more fire, climate change amplifies even more climate change. It's called the carbon feedback loop.
That carbon that we've been putting out of the atmosphere is now being released back into the atmosphere in terms of smoke, but it continues because the dead trees that come down, they will rot over the next 10 years and they're still releasing carbon.
They have now, in a period of a couple months, put as much carbon into the atmosphere because of these bushfires than they had put into the atmosphere from the last year.
Vibrant forests reduced to pools of soot. Many of the trees here are resilient to fire, but not these climate-amplified infernos.
These fires, being unusually hot and large scale, may mean the usual ways of forest regenerating don't exist, which then means that we don't get that big flush of regrowth, which would start to suck the carbon back in.
Some areas have been burnt 3 or 4 times in 25 years. So the frequency of fire and the interval between fire is changed, and if we don't manage that, we will lose those ecosystems because they simply can't have long enough to recover before they get smashed again. We're seeing fires in places that really shouldn't burn, such as subtropical rainforest.
The fire frequency is increasing, the size of the fires is increasing, they're becoming earlier.
Our fire season now can be like 8 months long. It's not just 3 months of summer. And if that certainly is the new norm for us, then we have to have a good think about what that looks like for us going forward.
So the fires that we have just experienced now occurred under 1 degree of global warming. So what can we expect in 20 or 30 years' time? What will these fires be like then?
Climate change is a global disease. Wildfires are just one symptom. Florida is no stranger to fire, but large-scale blazes are mitigated by controlled burns and built-in humidity. Here, the threat of climate change is not a song of fire, but of water.
We're the tip of the spear. One of the biggest impacts of climate change is sea level rise. And most people here in South Florida live at about sea level and near the sea.
If you're in southern Florida, if you've experienced flooding from these king tides, they inundate the streets of Miami Beach and Fort Lauderdale. Add on these intense hurricanes and the storm surge from those events. Pretty soon you're talking about large parts of the coast of Florida becoming uninsurable.
Sea levels are projected to rise between 8 and 14 inches over the next 10 years, between a foot and 2 feet in 20 years, and as much as 3 feet by 2060.
We may see sea level rise in this century that could put 4 to 13 million Americans underwater permanently. It may not be possible in all places to keep that water out.
And it's those numbers that are forcing many shoreline communities to do the unthinkable: retreat.
5 years ago, when I started thinking about retreat, it was considered a far-off future option. That has rapidly changed as different local governments, different states are thinking about how to manage flood risk into the future.
Regardless of where you are now, whether it's Florida, whether it's here in Australia, the impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. We're seeing them play out in real time now, and we're already seeing the threat that they pose to us and our environment.
New Year's Eve blazes ripped across the south coast, including in Mogo.
So the wraparound veranda went all the way around.
Okay. Ray Harvey runs Wild to Free Kangaroo Sanctuary here.
That's the fire break into Mogo.
She was forced to flee by boat and watch this peninsula burn.
You have kangaroos that obviously depend on you to a certain extent. What was that like, being out there and looking back at that?
I thought they were all going to be dead, every single one.
But there were survivors, and Harvey is again taking care of them.
This is Honey. She's in critical condition and we can't treat her just yet. We've lost about 2/3 of the population here, and we have some that are injured, and we have some that are perfectly fine. This is Cricket. We've been able to give her some much needed antibiotics today. My job right now is to stay here and keep everything as normal as possible to maintain their calmness. So I just act like everything's completely normal around here.
We've got a big mess to clean up today, haven't we? Look at the mess you guys made.
I'm only here for them. Yeah, it'd be easy to walk away from all this and go and live in a nice capital city where it's safe and I've got all of my conveniences and a nice little house. So it's my job, and many other wildlife carers down here feel it's their responsibility to keep them alive.
The fires have pressed other wildlife experts into emergency action. A dozen koala were rescued from the Blue Mountains and brought here, the Taronga Zoo in Sydney.
The fire was moving quite quickly towards them, and then thankfully it shifted and enabled access into the national park to save them.
They were found by a radio transmitter tagged on one of the animals' ears, and now cared for around the clock until they can safely be released back into the wild.
Those animals who were lucky enough to survive the fire face another potentially deadly threat: the almost total loss of their food supply.
Koala lives in eucalyptus trees and it feeds on the leaves from those trees. So while they're burnt, that means that their habitat is limited and the food is even worse.
Koala also face the threat of development. They simply have less land to choose from, causing a population bottleneck.
And so then when a fire goes through, instead of taking a small portion of a population out, it takes a large number out.
But the ultimate threat to both of these species lies with the planet's biggest challenge.
This wasn't an ordinary fire. This was a climate change disaster and a tornado.
While the animals of Australia face the danger from fire, the biggest threat to our wildlife stems from water.
Sea level rise. This is something that's probably the single most catastrophic potential here in the state of Florida. 1 foot sea level rise will wipe out half of the habitat for most of the animals that live in the Everglades. The key deer. Here's an animal that lives basically on a key that is only a few feet above sea level. 1 foot rise in sea level could wipe out the entire population of key deer. The manatee, with the warming of the oceans, you've got algae blooms, you've got red tide. Red tide causes a type of toxin that was found to kill almost 200 manatees a couple of years ago. We are directly connected. Look at Australia. It could be the canary in the coal mine of what could happen here in South Florida. When it comes to fires, when it comes to hurricanes, when it comes to droughts, all those things have catastrophic effects and are in the future for us if things don't change.
What can the rest of the world learn about what you guys have gone through with this?
Well, I mean, don't take things for granted, that's for sure. And habitat preservation is just so important.
There needs to be a change in value system. We need to value these amazing animals and biosphere around us, because you see what happens when you get some things out of order.
This is not fake news. This is science. And people need to understand how important it is, if not for themselves, for their kids and their kids after that.
Protect your animals. Don't let progress get in the way of nature. Nature's really important, and protect it with everything that you've got. Because this was called the Nature Coast. Now it's gone. Don't let yours go. Because we've lost ours. And I'm heartbroken.
Professor Van Oppen tells us her research gives her hope for the future of coral reefs, but stresses the need for climate change action if we want to save our reefs for future generations.
Ultimately, we have to do something about climate change, climate warming, because if we don't address that in the long term, the reef will continue to decline.
And that is a threat that really hits home. Over the last 30 years, the world has lost half of the ocean's corals, and Florida has not been spared.
I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The state of the Florida Reef Tract is dire. We are losing corals at an unprecedented rate.
I would suggest that for the first time in human history, we are witnessing potentially the loss of an ecosystem.
The parallels are uncanny.
We've had episodes of climate change related bleaching episodes that have caused corals to die off. We've had generally poor water quality that has fostered and promoted the growth of seaweeds instead of corals.
But Florida's reeling reefs have the insults of another climate change-fueled culprit to contend with: stony coral tissue loss disease.
What's unusual about this disease, it's probably the worst coral disease outbreak that's ever been recorded anywhere in the world. This is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. This is the last kind of thing in a series of events that have happened for Florida's reefs.
Like Australia, our reefs are our protectors and our providers.
Reefs are the rainforest of the oceans. They're also a huge economic engine for us. Tourism, people come here to fish, to go diving, to go snorkeling. All of that can be catastrophically wiped out just by 1 or 2 degree rise in temperature.
They actually protect our coastlines from storms. And in a situation in Miami where everybody's worried about sea level rise, everybody's worried about storm surge, people in Miami Beach are particularly worried about coastal inundation, here's a situation where the natural resources are actually helping protect us from those threats, and yet we're not taking the necessary measures to protect them from the threats that we ourselves are creating.
Like the Great Barrier Reef, our tract is part of our identity.
Without the reefs, we don't have anything in the Keys. The reefs are everything. They're what the economy is based on. It's what people's livelihoods are based on. It's what, people's social lives and memories and experiences are based on. And without the coral, no one's going to have those memories in the future.
After 6 months, the fires are finally out in Australia.
Total devastation.
But the recovery is just beginning. 46 million acres of damage, and the concern for the future grows.
How does it make you feel to look out and see this and think that this is yours, this is your property,
Well,
we're standing on your...
I've been thinking to myself, I'm a bushfire victim, Angie, but after a while, I started to get a realisation a couple of days ago. I thought, no, I'm not. I'm a victim of climate change. And I really believe that, because things are just getting out of hand.
Michael Green is a resident of Dargan, a city in the iconic Blue Mountains here. He lost his home of 22 years to the massive blazes last month.
I think we have to really start looking at what we're doing. The world needs a wake-up call. There's definitely something happening, and I don't care if people deny it. They say there's no climate change. But, there's too much happening. In too many places, too many records being broken.
It's not close to home in America. Why should they care, seeing what you guys are going through?
I would say to them is that don't think it can't happen to you, no matter where you are. Sooner or later, it's going to affect us all. If it keeps going the way it's going.